Carina is here today to talk about handcrafting community. She's been accidentally forming micro-communities since the 90s, and it turns out you can do it on purpose too. So please welcome her.
Yeah, as Pete said, my name is Carina Zona, and as you can see, this talk is called Handcrafting Community. Exploring that started for me on a San Francisco night almost 2 years ago. I had walked into a hack night in San Francisco where I did not live at the time, and for the first time in my life, I saw 100 developers in one room, in one place. And the particularly amazing part for me was that every one of them was women. Even in a tech center like San Francisco, that was still a really rare feat. And it was this group's inaugural night, which made it all the more surprising. So within a week, that group had a weekly Rails study group as well, and started holding hack nights, and 80 people would consistently show up. It got more and more amazing to me. And then within a few months, there was also a Python study group that was meeting weekly. All these things had happened, and it was just one person who'd put out word like, hey, come. And somehow this community had sprung up overnight. So I was so awed by that, and at the same time, I was also, kind of mystified, because there's this one person, and suddenly here's this big thing. And it just had coalesced, and it seemed a little bit magical, because most of us try to do that stuff, and it doesn't take off, right? So all this time, I had been living in much smaller towns and suburbs, and there you get, like one user group. You get the web group, and it's got the designers and the programmers, and they're probably like, okay, the last one I had, it was the Linux user group, and it covered anything. And even those groups would kind of wobble along, and as soon as the founder kind of lost interest, usually they'd fade out. And that's not really what community is. Community should be something sustainable, and it should be able to self-sustain even when people move on. So all of that got me pretty curious, and I wanted to know, how do communities come to life in the first place? Because some do seem to come together that effortlessly, and they become that self-sustaining, but there's all these other ones that just never get their feet under them. So what makes that difference between success and failure? What does it take to be a community builder in the first place? So that's what I've been trying to satisfy my curiosity with ever since that night. So community, it's a word that we throw around a lot, and we apply it to many things. The communities that I've been curious about, though, are the old school kind, where it's impersonal and it's connected to an actual geographic location. So we're not talking about things like mailing lists. And in a community, the members' identity and social ties are all grounded in certain qualities, things that they share, like shared intentions, shared values, beliefs, resources, needs, and the really big one is sharing a sense of purpose. And when all those things come together as a group, they also form cohesive group. So that curiosity started leading to really interesting places, and I have gotten to know a number of builders in our coding community just by asking questions. And some of the questions I asked them were about, how did you get things started? How did they grow? How did they survive those rocky periods when people start to have tensions or disagree on what the heck this thing's supposed to be next? How did they get the ball rolling enough that it just kept on rolling all on its own? Here are some of the people who shared their stories with me. They come from Ruby community, and they come from a lot of other communities too. I observed, I chatted, I've interviewed, and I listened. And I asked about those successes. I also asked about their regrets and their failures. So today, you're going to hear some of those personal stories that they shared with me. You're going to hear them collectively and in their own words. You can put on good presentations, you can provide beer and pizza. People will show up for that. But it's really different when people start to feel like these are friends, that there's shared history between them now. What the builders told me is that small is good. Starting small isn't committing to small. You can start small, you can start local. Many said that their networks were the safety net that allowed them to jumpstart something that others would have thought were a little bit risky and some thought were a lot risky. I knew that I had enough connections that it wouldn't be a catastrophic failure if anything went wrong. That gave me the ability to make that leap of faith that I would be supported regardless. A lot of people feel like they have to be altruistic in their community building, that they have to do something for the common good, that it's selfish to make something just for themselves. Don't worry, scratch your own itch. If you feel a need, trust that other people have the same need and they'll be really grateful that you built something for them too. I didn't feel like the existing groups were a good fit for me. I'm a coder, but I don't feel like I live for coding. The groups at that time weren't the type of people I could connect with because of that. I wasn't sure whether anyone else felt what I felt and wanted this too, but what I learned out of that experience is that if you feel a certain way, you're probably not the only one. You think it's like throwing a birthday party for yourself. You worry that only your friends will come. You don't expect that anyone else is going to show up, and you worry. And then they do show up. There's this sort of myth that community builders have to be extroverted, they have to know everyone, they have to just be so, rah. Not true. Many of the people I talk to are shy themselves, but some interesting things happen for them. I'm a shy person by nature, but through this I've learned to connect with people and why that's so important. I've gotten good at it. It's all about the strength of crowds. I was way less outgoing than I am now. A side effect of doing the group is that it's practice for me in talking in front of people casually. It helped me deal with a lot of stage fright. Now I feel comfortable. It's been like therapy in a way. Something that's really important and something that's either a make or break is setting explicit values. And the sooner you can set them for your community, the better. Folks always should understand explicitly why they're doing this. And they should be able to see that whatever they're achieving is the thing they wanted to achieve. So what do we mean by value? Well, in this context, we're talking about a unifying principle for the group, something that they can organize choices around and that's going to be a beacon to others saying, this is where I belong, this is my group. And it sets a course of action for everything that the community does. It's a way to measure yourself. And that way it's a community call to action. And there's lots of different possibilities for what that communal value is. For one group, it's challenge. That was their key word. The founder said, I wasn't used to being challenged. I wasn't used to being surrounded by people much more advanced to me. It was really inspiring. And that gave something to work with. For another group, it was about accessibility. And they looked at that in a variety of dimensions, including things like income, gender diversity, racial diversity. But in particular, they were really challenged to live up to that notion of accessibility when they were looking for a venue for an event. It wasn't wheelchair accessible. And so we concluded that that's just not fair, that someone might not be able to participate. Some groups are interested in being a pipeline to other segments of the community. They don't see themselves as a community in itself. They see them as a way, an entry point into what already exists and is thriving. It's not a single event to us. We view it as a pipeline. It's a starting point. Before leaving, we call out the next one for the people who are there. A number of the groups that I've dealt with, and you heard Pete mention some names, are explicitly intended to foster diversity. What we set out to build was for everybody who shares a common interest in diversifying the community. We're not trying to start a women's community. We're trying to develop a diverse community for everyone out of the community we already have. It's a break from the mainstream. We're not trying to change the mainstream. We're trying to provide an alternative for those who want that space. For another community, and I heard this one over and over again from members of it, equality is their key word. And they try to live that out in everything that they do and organize. One of the things is they have a policy of everybody pays. When you go to an event, everyone, including the organizers, is expected to pay. And they consider that part of their ethos, that everyone is going to come together and everyone is part of the community. And there shouldn't be any barriers to entry on that. One of the big things that people told me is that their networks weren't just a safety net, but sometimes they were actually the saving grace. I picked organizers' brains a lot. People in the Valley who had the most successful meetups, I talked to them over and over again. And I asked questions like, how do I not fuck this up? I didn't know people would be so generous with their time and their advice. The connections that you know, the people that you can rely on to get your back, those people are exceedingly important. How do you know you're not just running blind? How do you know you're not just duplicating work? How do you get support for what you're doing? How do you know when your idea just plain sucks? And yet at the same time, don't let that hold you down. If you don't have a great big network full of those people, that's not a reason to hold off. Networks aren't mandatory. I didn't really know anybody. It was really weird how word just somehow got out. And then people got excited and they started following the Twitter account, and then somebody built a website. It grew organically. It was really free form. It just started to build momentum on its own. And one of the ways you can do that is by putting word out beyond your own personal reach. I invited everyone I knew personally. And then I reached out to my network and I had them invite everyone they knew personally. Mentors, supporters, they all reached out into their circles as well. And when you put that word out, I made it really, really easy for them to spread the word. That person didn't have to do anything but hit a button to share it. She made sure that it was all less than 140 characters for sure. She wanted to make it really simple for them to understand, simple for them to communicate, like the elevator speech, but in 140 characters, because she wanted them to be able to talk about it. So use that social media. Use your friends, use your networks, use their friends of friends of friends if you have to. Start to spread the word, and people will come out of the woodwork. Caveat here is some people think, I said scratch your itch. If that itch is, I need business, I want to meet the people who are going to start buying, hiring me and buying contracts, it's not going to work. Community building is a lot of work, and you're building it for people who are probably not going to be the ones who hire you or give you business. They're the people who share your own needs as well. Don't use it for your own purposes. Anyone who wants to get work that way, let me tell you, this is probably the worst way to go about it. I suggest you look elsewhere for that. One of my favorite insights was the number of people who said that their biggest screw-ups, their most nightmarish moments, turned out to be the best surprises that they could have encountered. For one, elevators broke at a crucial moment, so we decided to squeeze everyone into just one room. And some of those people were really unhappy. But then, after a little while, they started finding that they had this shared common experience that was happening. They weren't fragmented across different rooms. And they liked it so much that they actually made a decision next year, we're going to do this on purpose. And people loved that. So when you get something right, whether it's by accident or on purpose, start to package it up. What you do well, make it turnkey for the next person. We made ourselves a workshop in a box so that new organizers can just unbox that and make their next event. They don't have to redo all that work to make the high-quality event that we did the first time. It's really easy to be a solo builder. It's hard work, and it's often hard to find someone to do it with you. And the people who commit to it, often some of them fall away. So you can end up really easily with just one leader, and that's a terrible, terrible idea. It's a bug. It's a fail point. It's hard to get people to do that big work, the stuff that takes commitment to follow through, and I think that's why a lot of groups collapse. If I left this group of mine, I wonder if it would collapse too. You do need someone who the buck stops with, but if I disappeared, I suspect everything would go away. We haven't figured out as a group how to not have that single point of failure. I've had trouble doing delegation. I tended to do all of it myself. I've had to learn to let go. I'm doing better at it. The thing is that I'm still responsible for what I'm doing, but I understand now that that just doesn't scale well. So, if you have just that one person driving it, it's easy to think it's a community just with somebody who's really overburdened. But the reality is, if you look back at those criteria for a community, it's about people coming together, socializing, bonding, sharing something. One person driving a community isn't a community. It's just a person with a lot of drive. So how do you get over that hump? How do you deal with that really common scenario? First thing you should be doing as a builder is get into a habit of self-replicating and having everyone else in the community do the same thing. Because life circumstances are always changing and volunteers drop out constantly. It's the nature of the beast. So you always need to be training your replacement, and you should be doing that from day one. If you wait until you're burned out and ready to leave, it's still going to be a failure for the group. So I knew I wasn't going to be the organizer forever. It was my intention to not be the organizer forever. Anyone should be able to take over and get up to speed quickly. So that was a priority. When you're invested like that, it can get really personal for you. Spending significant amounts of time as a builder is a significant amount of time being taken away from your personal life, your work life, from other things that you want to pursue. It's a choice. You know, no one's forcing you, but the thing is, things do get really personal. You start feeling very invested in what you've built. And for some people, that can be really hard. It really hurt to see all that work that I'd put into for years, to see that wind up badly in the end. It felt like that work had been for naught. It's been hard for me to even be there. And I know I'm probably overreacting. Hacking communities can be exhausting. It can be depressing. Sometimes you pay a high price. That doesn't mean stop, it means go faster, so the next person will benefit and they'll be able to do it easier. Keep building what you're passionate about. Keep going. It'll pay off. So their advice over and over again was, yeah, build something. It doesn't have to be big. It's just about starting something. It's about people, giving them something to come to. And some of them had the pleasure of saying, you can start with that tiny thing, the thing that we thought no one would come to in the first place. And then somehow it grew and it became something with global impact. That's pretty neat. So there are a number of builders here in this room today, and I think it's a great time to be able to say thank you to all of them.
Thanks, builders.
And not only do we have those builders, but we have some very recent builders in Burlington. And they're having a lunch today at noon. So if you've been involved in any way with tech outreach for women or tech women's groups, we would like to have you join. Girl Develop It, Dev Chicks, Railsbridge, and Lambda Ladies. There are leaders from all of them in Burlington and living here. And this is an opportunity to come and meet a bunch of people who are doing that work and building something local. So please do join us for lunch. Thank you. If you have questions about something, I would love to talk with you. So I'm going to leave it up to the audience whether you want to go early. I think I've just made that very tempting. Do you want to go early to lunch? Raise your hand if you don't. Alex.
I don't have a question. I want to know everyone else's question.
I think I saw one other hand raised. Okay. Oh, no, two. This is great. Okay.
So if you're in a place that doesn't have any sort of technology community around it at all, for
Yeah.
instance, I live right outside of Woodstock, New York, and so one of the first things I did when I moved there was look for a meetup.
Yeah.
How do you go, there aren't any development firms that advertise, there
Yeah.
just isn't anything. How do you go about finding those first couple of people?
Yeah.
How do you make it interesting for a group of maybe 3 or 4?
I'm going to answer that in a couple of, there's several questions you have buried in there, so I'll try to answer them, and if I miss one, let me know. I talk to so many people who thought they were in those same circumstances, and inevitably, once they put word out, I want to do something, and the crucial difference was do something, rather than say I'm interested in doing something, by actually just saying, hey, even just, hey, let's get together at the bar on Thursday night, but making it known beyond your just friends. People started coming out of the woodwork, and you found that there were, in fact, other people. The luncheon I just talked about, those groups didn't know about each other until we said, hey, let's have lunch. And one by one, we all got to meet each other and said, well, this is just ridiculous. They're all over Burlington, for goodness sake. A lot of the groups that started off small said that they were really able to piggyback on things that were larger. In Python community, there is a unifying organization called Python Software Foundation, and they do stuff like they fund outreach for new groups. So if something is forming or someone wants to form something, they provide some resources. And they provide a lot of logistical support for that, and sometimes will provide money for builders to come in. In small towns, usually what happens is it's a group of people who share common need, not necessarily common purpose. So like I talked about, user groups were really generic, like calling it a Linux user group because it had been a Linux user group for 20 years, and at some point, people started invading because they had nothing else, right? So if you can find anyone who has essentially common cause and getting together with them for a while, slowly you start to be the people that others are identifying as someone to get together with. When I talked to Pete, actually, that was very much what happened. Adam, Pete, who was the other person that started WAG? Okay. Hey, so the three of them just got together for beers, and then out of that, somehow 3 different groups eventually formed, and then a conference. So you can start with just a teeny bit as long as you put out word publicly that we would like to have you come out too.
And what strategies do you use to get that word out when there isn't already an established?
Yeah, well, I tried to address that partially. Those are times when having some knowledge of what exists out there, even if it's not local to you, can be really helpful. The Boston Ruby group was actually doing for a while video streaming to some smaller groups, including this one, and also in New Hampshire, and briefly, I believe, in Buffalo. And that was joining 150 people in Boston with much smaller groups that didn't have that ability to essentially gather that many people together at one time, but allowed for a lot more interaction. It also allowed for throwing support behind those smaller groups. And for instance, turning out people elsewhere, even in Vermont or New Hampshire, that didn't know there was something there. So in Python community, it's really easy to turn to people because they've got this unifying group called the Software Foundation, and there's a lot of money put into it. So if there's not someone nearby, they're able to hook you up with something that is nearer than what you've got. Yeah. Oh, wow, cool. We went from 2 to 5. Okay.
So you say don't build career, build community, and I totally get what that means. You want to build a community of people with the same needs as you. So, somebody who needs to hire someone is not who's in your community, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder about a group sort of specifically around building career, like maybe people who are
Right.
in the field. And,
Right.
Right. What, although I imagine those are particularly prone to people leaving because they got a job and they're not
Right,
really moving
right.
forward. Do you have any?
Well, I think the part about don't use it for personal purposes is in part about you're violating trust. If people feel like the reason you're leading this thing is out of some sort of self-interest, it doesn't feel like a community for them. It feels like, they're essentially the stooges. If you have a group that's built around those needs in the first place, that's a really different story. That's not a betrayal of trust. That's, meeting exactly the needs of the group. So I think you have to look at context. I think it also really helps to have some sort of communication between the people who are dealing this as to what is our community values? Like that was the starting point, right? Like shared values and resources and needs. As this group devoted to job hunting, what are our values around that? And that might be, what do we think is an ethical referral? What do we think is, an appropriate way to share information? all that kind of stuff. So that could easily be something that's appropriate in that context.
Do you know any good ones like that as a model?
No. That's a local question, so I'm going to leave that to some locals to attempt to answer if we have anyone here who can answer that right now. Okay. So that'll be a good thing to get together over lunch and discuss that one more. Okay, so there's several hands, but who was the one who had raised it first before? Was that you? Go for it.
I wonder if you came across any examples in your research of groups that share a lot of shared purpose but are distinct groups, like collaborating or using
Yeah.
techniques that kind of.
So I just spoke at PyCon Australia, and I asked a lot of questions about how they did that because they're in a town considerably smaller than this, and they're in Tasmania, which is basically as far as you can get from anything that looks like a well-populated continent. Oh, they're going to be so insulted. But it's the departing point for Antarctica. So it really is. So they had a very small community, and yet they were able to put on this big conference for like 300 people. And I asked, how did you do that? And the answer was that the Linux community on the mainland of Australia had formed an organization that they developed enough infrastructure for creating conferences that they said, well, like, we can give that to other people, like we can give our solutions. Like I said, like the turnkey solution, we're practically there anyway. So it's just a matter of rebranding it essentially and letting someone else run with that. And then what happened is that model was so successful that other groups, I think there was a PHP group, and I'm trying to remember what the other one was. It might be .NET, but one by one, they started to be able to use that resource. They weren't at all the same group. They weren't pulling on the same people. The continent is big enough to have a real Linux user group, but it was a way for them to share and partner. And the interesting thing about that is the partnership kind of cascaded. So PyCon then was able to do what they call a mini conf, where they're providing all of that infrastructure for the conference they're building, and then they turn it over to a user group that wants to do whatever they do. So a day before the conference, there's some other conference that wasn't organized by them, but availed themselves of all the resources, like, oh, we've got a venue, we've got all these rooms, whatever. All you need to do is decide what all the tracks are, and you're done. So you see this stuff starting from big infrastructure and partnerships that are just facilitating the people who have a little less resources and allowing them to level up essentially in subsequent years, put on their own stuff.
What about people like in the same geographic area that are running groups that are very similar? I'm not sure whether they all exist in San Francisco, like Railsbridge and PyLadies.
Yeah, they're really not occupying the same space, and most of them, like PyLadies, came directly out of Women Who Code. Girl Develop It was completely independent. Women Who Code was very much inspired by Railsbridge. The Rails study group came directly out of Railsbridge graduating class. Black Girls Code was inspired by the founders of Railsbridge. Rails Girls was founded by someone who graduated from Railsbridge and then took it back to our own country and did a lot of modification of that model to make it something that better suited their needs. But yeah, there's a lot of that stuff. What I saw over and over again is people who thought they started something alone were actually piggybacking on something that was successful and it was a good model, whether it was local to them or not. They knew how to, stand on the shoulder of giants, right? That's what we say. So they were really good at doing that. I'm trying to think of some instances, particularly of partnerships. Let me rack my brain a little bit on that one, and let's revisit your question. I will attempt to do so. Yes?
Do you have examples? The examples you gave are all a lot about, I would say, process in the sense that, like,
Yeah.
They're
Fair enough.
talking about what we in this room do, not, the person who's in construction management or whatever. Like, how do you, the domains that we work on, right? Are there groups that you've seen that are about the domain of the business, not the method of the business, right? So I work at Zendesk. If there were a help desk or a community support group, right? Not just Zendesk users, but other customer support people. Have you talked to groups that are around a domain rather than a bridge or something?
Well, I guess I'm having trouble with the word domain versus process. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, okay. So, what's a good example of this? Facebook uses Python, right? And so
Right.
their programmers might go to a Python meetup, but the product isn't Python, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
The product is social community or something,
Right.
or
Right.
maybe advertising, depending on how you look at it. A group, a meetup about social community, or a meetup about advertising, rather than a meetup about Python.
Yeah. I was really interested in specifically communities of coders. So although I know that those things exist, and particularly in San Francisco, and I'm sure in New York, I don't have answers for you as to how they're doing that. And before I move on to another question, I just remembered part of an answer for you. So in Australia, basically any major city is an hour plane ride from any other major city, and they didn't have any real thriving Rails community in any of those individual towns. And so what they did was they found ways to gather collectively. They formed Rails camps, where they literally go camping as all the Rails developers in Australia, and they'll get 30 to 60 people total. But that's a way to find your tribe, essentially, and then that also led to them eventually organizing a conference. For so many of these groups, they started out with, it was a couple of us, and then we had a user group, and then it got to a point where we looked at each other and said, why haven't we had a conference yet? So these things just seem to feel like a really natural progression for a lot of people, and that's an example of something where you start off small, believing you don't have the resources, not feeling like you can sustain something because it's so small, and the answer was to partner up with other people who have the same problem, even if they are really far away, find some common ground. Geologically somehow. They are out in the desert. Yes?
So I'm from Seattle, where there's basically 10 user groups for everything imaginable. And so I hear what you're saying, and I'm so excited about the idea of maybe starting something. But I always go back and forth between, is it more helpful to the community to start something, or to invest in a community that is already existing, or how do you kind of work with that?
I'm not going to say better. I think it is, both of those models are really good, and I talked to people who had essentially inherited some aspect of a group. In some cases, it was something that was kind of dying, and they revived it. In some cases, it was something that seemed like a really good idea, and somebody just needed to move on, and so, it was like, here, this is great. I'm burnt out. Please take it. But for some, it really was, there's already something existing. You might as well kind of catch those coattails. There's an existing brand, which means you can get reach very easily. You don't have to come up with publicizing this thing from nothing. You've got some sort of group to just basically put out to their couple of 100,000 people. Well, probably not 100,000. Several thousand people, really easily. When Women Who Code was formed, that was definitely instrumental. Railsbridge has been really instrumental in getting those words out to other groups, and not just in San Francisco. I know Rails Girls has also done the same thing, especially on Twitter. They've been really good at helping connect people. Yeah. Oh.
So I started the local chapter of Girl Development here in Burlington,
and is host of the lunch. Hi, Maureen.
So the part that you mentioned about building something that's sustainable and making sure that you have, community members that can step in if something were to happen, and I
Yeah.
sort of think about that. So, how do you know you're doing enough to build something that's sustainable and would still be around if, I got hit by a bus tomorrow or something like that? How do I know I'm doing enough?
I suspect you do know. Honestly, an easy cue is if you go on vacation, are all the classes going to have to be on hiatus? That would be a really good cue. I think one of the things that was really illustrative for me is when I needed to take a step back, when I had some serious burnout and overload, and I watched 4 people fill my shoes, and I realized that was a case of my failure of not letting people, become leaders and foster that. And I really believed I was going to be that point of fail, that things were going to kind of be suffering for a while. So you can believe that things are self-sustaining and walk away and discover they're not. You can also think that, like, you're the pivotal person and find that there are many people who've been eagerly waiting for the chance to step in. So I'm not sure that you can have a clear indication, but realistically, there are some cues. I mean, you know that if you were to go off for 6 months, who's going to keep that running? You may have some of your teachers that would, but do you know that? Could you identify right now? Okay, I thought I saw a couple more hands in this area. Did I get back to yours sufficiently? Good. Oh, awesome. All right, let's have lunch.